But the players are just about ready in the feature match area, so let's head on down for round number 3 of the 2-slot Pioneer RCQ here at the Apex Gaming home store in Caldwell, Ohio. All right, we are taking a mulligan. Do we know what the opponent is playing yet?
Red Black Midrange.
All right.
Okay. Rakdos Midrange as the opposing deck, so that's a good test for this Atarka Red strategy. Rakdos Midrange usually matches up pretty well against creature decks, got plenty of cheap interaction, though in this matchup, Thoughtseize and that Life Loss could end up being a liability.
Yeah, but stuff like Graveyard Trespasser and Sheoldred are just nightmares, right? Like, these are the types of decks that Rakdos wants to play against pretty regularly. They are well set up to interact early, but obviously the Atarka Red deck is extremely explosive sometimes. And if they're able to go multiple Burning Tree Emissaries on turn 2 with any follow-up, it could be enough to overwhelm the Rakdos player pretty easily. So,
Looks like a couple mulligans from one side.
all right, well, if it's the Atarka Red player mulliganing, it's going to be bad.
Yeah. Our Atarka Red player was on, looks like either 5 or maybe even 4 cards.
All right, here's a turn 1. Kamano faces Kakazin. I think it's a 5. I think there's 3 cards left in hand. Looks like Phoenix Chick, Green-Red Pathway, and something else. Zine Bruni on your left playing Rakdos Midrange. We've heard that name before. Thoughtseize here going to be the play. And we can take Swift Spear.
the other card.
Don't think you want to take Phoenix Chick. Taking Phoenix Chick usually means it can come back later. I think I'd rather just take the Swift Spear. But flying is a big deal. Putting a counter on it is a pretty fast clock next turn. So Zine Bruni might want to do that instead.
He's thinking about it. I would definitely be taking the Swifty.
All right. I think he agrees with you. Now, this mulligan to 5 is pretty devastating, but with a string of spells drawn off the top, Zachary Powers could be in a good position here to steal game 1. This Phoenix Chick's going to represent a clock that, even with an answer, could get validated later on. But we do have a way to put a counter on it with the Kamano, so pretty fast clock. 2 damage comes in.
Trying to get a look at what Powers drew for turn. Yeah,
So there's another land.
Yeah, so they're playing their Crack Crown Pathway on the Timber Crown side, in case they draw an Atarka's Command.
Can't do a whole lot with the green mana, honestly. The pathways, I think, are on red about 90% of the time. But, you know, if it's your only source of green, it's your only source of green.
Yeah, and usually the way that Timber Crown Pathway would mess up your curve is if you have a bunch of cards you're trying to deploy and you need to double spell. But after the double mulligan, that's just not really going to come up. Powers kind of playing 1 spell a turn here. So can afford to play that on the green side and make sure he has every single card in his deck alive.
All right, well, Bruni deploys this Monastery Swift Spear. Or, sorry, Zachary deploys the Monastery Swift Spear, and Zine Bruni has a lot of action with double. Fatal Push on turn 2. As an aggressive player, you hate to see 1 Fatal Push in the opener, but 2 is brutal.
Yeah, and with Black Lucas and Swamp, Bruni not dealing any damage to himself with the mana base, this would be an excellent start, even against a full 7-card hand from Zachary Powers. Against a 5-card hand, looks like this game is going to be over in a hurry. And now a Fable on turn 3, the linchpin card, I would say, of this Rakdos midrange deck. It just does a little bit of everything: generating value, pressure, mana, and giving you a way to smooth out your draws with that second chapter.
All right, well, we got a 2/2 Goblin from Chapter 1. If you notice, Zine actually has a Duress in hand, I think. And one of the strengths of Fable of the Mirror Breaker is being able to pitch kind of weaker cards or extra lands when you get to the early turns, or when you get to the later turns. But you want to have the ability to interact in the first few turns, so increasing the number of discard spells makes a lot of sense when you consider how it works with Fable of the Mirror Breaker.
Yeah, and Powers here just packing it in. Doesn't even want to try to struggle against this excellent opening 3 turns from Zine.
All right, well, game number 1 goes to Zine Bruni and Rakdos midrange. The mulligan to 5 plus a Thoughtseize was pretty brutal. Powers needed to draw a string of spells off the top, was unable to do so. Just a couple of lands and a quick concession, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to get out of there.
This Atarka red deck, it gives you time between rounds to get some lunch, get a snack. Maybe that's what Zachary Powers is looking for. But looking at his sideboard, see what he can do. 4 Rending Volley, not going to be relevant here. 2 Destructive Revelry. That can, maybe destroy a Fable, but I don't think it's good enough. 2 Obliterating Bolt, 1 Roiling Vortex, 2 Karizev's Expertise, 2 Squee Dubious Monarch, and 2 Experimental Frenzy. I think Powers are going to be looking to slow down, get some more powerful individual cards in his deck. The Squeeze and the Experimental Frenzies are excellent.
Yeah.
I could also potentially even see the Roiling Vortex, even if it's not great in this matchup, but this is definitely not a matchup, and this is not a deck that you want to over sideboard with. You got to leave your engine intact to make sure your Reckless Bushwhackers and Atarka's commands are as powerful as possible. So probably just the Squeeze and Frenzies coming in for Zachary Powers here.
Yeah, so if you notice, most of the aggro decks have an enchantment or a really powerful artifact in their sideboard that is specifically for this matchup. And Experimental Frenzy, while it can come in against things like Azorius Control, it's namely good against Rakdos because they have a lot of trouble removing those enchantments from the table. And so they're somewhat guaranteed to be able to generate as much value as their card allows. And in this instance, if you hit the 4th mana source for Experimental Frenzy, it is a GG because that card goes ballistic in this deck. However, I've been known to leave in Thoughtseize in this matchup, even though it might seem like it's bad. If you are able to take that engine card from them, it's very good. And something like Thoughtseize just gives you any way to interact on turn 1, so you don't have to like mulligan for Fatal Push all the time.
Yeah, looking at Zine Brunny's sideboard, I see a Pithing Needle, a Liliana of the Veil, a Rending Volley, 2 Kolaghan's Command, an Abrade, a Duress, a Necromentia, a Reckoner Bankbuster, a Sky Sovereign Console Flagship, and then the heavy hitters here at the end, 3 Ritual of Soot and 2 Extinction Event. 5 4-mana sweepers here in Zine Brunny's list. Those are going to be great against such a go-wide aggro deck.
Yeah.
The main question for me is, how much of this spot removal do you think Zine wants? The Kolaghan's Commands and Abrades obviously line up well against the small creatures in Zachary Powers' deck, but they are more expensive removal spells in a matchup where efficiency is key. So I lean against not bringing them in, although it depends on how many cards you want to bring out. But they are definitely options for Zine here.
Well, here's a better question. I want you to look over the main deck of the Rakdos deck real quick. I want you to tell me any card that you think should come out, because the only one I can really think of is something like Misery Shadow. The Rakdos deck is almost pre-sideboarded against aggro decks with how well their creatures play against them. Things like Bone Crusher Giant are excellent, and even Graveyard Trespasser in this matchup is an all-timer. And I think there's just not a whole lot that you can cut.
Well, I definitely like cutting the 2 Misery Shadows. We did see that Duress in game 1. I think that's going to come out. That's a singleton in the main deck. There's 2 copies of Liliana of the Veil.
Oh, those can definitely
Not a fan of those. So that's 5 cards that can come out for the 5 sweepers.
And then maybe you cut Thoughtseize for the spot removal. Most people do that, but I mean, you do just get juked by those sideboard cards sometimes if you do that.
Yeah, we'll see how Zine approaches the matchup. That's the real question. Does he want to trim on Thoughtseize to bring in some more, somewhat expensive spot removal, but has a pretty clean 5-for-5 swap to get those powerful sweepers into his deck for these post-sideboard games?
A lot of times when it comes to deck building, finding the easy in, easy out combinations is what makes or breaks your ability to compete in one of these tournaments. And it's one of the reasons why I've been putting a pretty big emphasis on building sideboard guides lately for all the decks that I build, because people just want to know how to sideboard, man. Like they don't have 40 hours a week to play Magic like I do.
Zachary Powers opens here with Kumano faces Kakazan. Actually, an excellent 1-drop to blunt potential fatal pushes. And looks to have a full grip of cards this time, so we'll see if his deck can put up a much better fight here against the Rakdos mid-range menace.
All right, well, Phoenix Chick is the play. It's going to get the counter and haste. The Monastery Solicitor comes down as well. We'll see if Zine Brunny has any 1-mana removal. Does not.
Yeah, definitely like putting the counter on the Phoenix Chick. That's the card that you would prefer Zine have to use his removal on,
right?
Because it can potentially come back later in the game.
But these are the types of draws where you can really get a leg up as the Atarka red player. Triple 1-drops on the play. The Rakdos mid-range deck without a fatal push, honestly, I don't know if they can get back in the game. And it's only turn 2.
And you expect without a fatal push, there would be a Bone Crusher Giant. There it is. And Zine does decide to use it on the Phoenix Chick rather than the Monastery Swift Spear because it is an automatic 2-power creature.
All right, we got a Burning Tree Emissary. That's going to allow for a Karizev, no haste, but still a very explosive start. And Zine Brunny is going to be looking for a sweeper here. Needs another turn. Let's see if he can put up any sort of defense, and then maybe Ritual of Soot next turn.
See a Dreadbore in Bruni's hand. That could easily target the Kari Zephyr and blunt some of this aggression from Powers.
Yeah, but it's still 6 damage minimum coming through.
Yeah.
Tough spot.
And that's what happens.
See if Powers can close it out here. Atarka's command is pretty strong. Maybe a play with fire, burn spell to give prowess, do a little bit of extra damage.
Darkest Man is lethal.
Bang! Jeej! Or did your quick math not work out?
No. Oh, yeah, it's a little short. Okay. There need to be one more creature.
All right. Well, Zine Bruni, no sweeper, packs it in, and we have a game 3 on our hands, just like that.
Yeah.
Lightning quick.
Our spotter was a little quick with the life totals there, so they'd already taken the 3 off. We can say Bruni was at 13. And I looked up at the life total and saw 10. I was like, okay, it's lethal from 10.
Ross always has an excuse when he's wrong. That's all I'm saying. All right. Well, we've already gone over these player sideboards. We kind of know what to expect. I don't know if there's going to be too much hemming and hawing here. The only real question is whether or not to leave in Thoughtseize and how many. And I think that if you want to get in some of the spot rule spells, you got to cut Thoughtseize. But if you don't interact on turn 1, chances are this Atarka red deck's going to roll you over if they get to keep a good 7.
Yeah, we saw a pretty reasonable, opening from Bruni there. Had interaction on turn 2 and 3, but because they didn't have interaction on turn 1 and Powers had a pretty strong draw on the play, they just got rolled over. They absolutely needed the sweeper on turn 4 and didn't have it. And that is the power of this Atarka red deck. For things like Burning Tree Emissary and Kumano Faces Kakazan can ensure that you're able to develop these wide battlefields even in the face of spot removal and, just out-tempo your opponent.
Yeah, so one of the cool things about Pioneer is that we do have access to a lot of really powerful, cheap interaction. I know a lot of people hem and haw about, having to play against Thoughtseize a bunch and having to play against Fatal Push a bunch. These are 2 cards that are essentially just a way for you to play catch-up against a format full of bonkers cards, like Pioneers. A very powerful format, and without that cheap interaction, decks like Rakdos Midrange couldn't really exist. We see iterations of Rakdos and variations of it in Standard, and it's able to compete there because Standard is a relatively low power level format. But when it gets to something like Pioneer, even into Modern, having Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, Spell Pierce, these are all essentially just gating mechanics to make sure that there are checks and balances for overly powerful stuff.
Definitely an important part of a balanced metagame. Interesting here watching both players dipping back into their sideboards pretty quickly between games 2 and 3. That to me indicates that both of them have plans for this matchup that alter whether or not they are on the play or the draw.
Okay.
Potentially Powers bringing in those obliterating bolts, maybe thinks he needs a little bit of spot removal on the draw to get through things like Graveyard Trespasser or even Bone Crusher Giant. Unfortunately, Obliterating Bolt doesn't match up well against Shieldred. Would have preferred to do something like Roast, but you also need Obliterating Bolt to deal with things like Old Growth Troll and the mono green matchup. So a bit of a tight squeeze there for a deck that can't really fit in much removal.
It's honestly incredible to me how cool Magic is in general. Just if you think about the fact that Shieldred has 5 toughness instead of 4, just ruins plans. Just ruins them. Obliterating Bolt was this awesome card that got reprinted, or they got printed that, essentially was Lava Coil but fixed for an era of Planeswalkers. And it just isn't good enough. It just doesn't kill Shieldred. So we have to look for ways that do. And there aren't a whole lot of 2-mana red spells that kill Shieldred. It's basically just Roast. And so you see like some waffling between Obliterating Bolt and Roast pretty often in red decks.
Okay, Zine Bruni starting on a tap line here, so another game with no turn 1 interaction, but being on the play going to make that easier. And here we see a Misery Shadow, so decided to keep those in. Maybe that's one of the cards he likes more on the play.
Sure. Here's turn 2 Burning Tree. We're going to Stomp, and that's going to give him an answer to the Misery Shadow and allow for full usage of the mana from Burning Tree, essentially making it free. Attacking for another 1.
This is a solid start from Powers.
All right, what can we do for 3 mana if you're Zine Bruni? If you have Graveyard Trespasser, I think that's automatic. Maybe you have 2 removal spells. You can play both of those here with your 3 mana. Liliana the Veil is still in the deck too. I wonder how Zine Bruni sideboarded it. If they're not boarding out Misery Shadow and Liliana, I wonder how they get the sweepers in.
Yeah, I imagine they have brought out their thoughts.
Yeah, they may also do the thing where they cut a bunch of one of things, you know. It's a fairly common sideboard tactic. But here we have a Dreadbore. It's going to take out Burning Tree, and we're back Powers' way.
Yeah, just keep limiting that battlefield until you can get to your heavy hitters. You know, a Shieldered on this battlefield would be excellent.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Powers with only one creature to add to this battlefield, so not a great turn 3 after 2 turns to start the game that were quite powerful.
Yeah, a third land I think would have unlocked a lot of stuff. Just casting Bone Crusher Giant's probably okay, but my guess is Powers' hand is full of things like Atarka's Command and Experimental Frenzy, and now he just needs mana to be able to deploy.
Well, there was a shock here from Bruni when they're leaving 2 mana untapped, so that suggests a 2 mana spell. It could be a stomp, could be a power word kill.
All right, well, Powers is going to end of turn play with fire. That's going to go upstairs. Obviously, you can pay 1 for the Misery Shadow to keep it alive. Luckily for Powers, the Phoenix Chick has flying, but a removal spell on it will exile it thanks to the Misery Shadow's ability. And now Bruni has the option to play a removal spell here, but deciding to pass the turn.
Looks like Kumano faces Kakazan and Atarka's Command at the top of Powers' hand. And unfortunately, this Misery Shadow kind of brickwalling the team, at least brickwalling the Legion Loyalist.
Legion Loyalist is one that I quite like. You know, it's really, really good in the Goblins decks because it makes Goblin Piledriver have Trample and First Strike. And that oftentimes just overwhelms a lot of people. In this build, it's a way to make your creatures be able to attack through 1 toughness creatures easily, or just make tokens not be able to block. The fact that it has haste is pretty sweet too, but I'm not sure. It's definitely not at its best in Atarka Red, but it's still certainly fine. All right, here we have an EOT kill Phoenix Chick. It's going to exile it.
Yeah, that is the power word kill. Interesting, you know, wants to deal with the flyer, but with 2 creatures on the battlefield, power is not that far away from being able to return that one from the graveyard.
All right, we need to tap red mana for that. We'll get that fixed. Okay, cool. Easy untap. And now it looks like we also have a Liliana the Veil, so we can use that and aggressively discard since we're empty-handed.
Yeah.
And with Powers missing land drops, this is going to be pretty devastating.
Yeah, this is about as good as Liliana the Veil can be in this matchup.
Yeah, normally not so great, but when your opponent is stuck on 2 lands with a handful of, you know, those sideboard cards and Atarka's Command, it's tough. Discards Experimental Frenzy, one that's normally outrageous in this matchup, but just not nearly enough lands to deploy it.
And no play here for Powers. And
this is a wink, no play situation, though. This is I'm going to Atarka's Command you at the end of turn.
Was that a squee? Yeah.
It looks like a squee, yeah.
That's a pretty good one to discard to Liliana since you can escape it from the graveyard.
Yeah, but still pretty far away from escape. It costs 4, I believe. A lot of ways to use extra mana here in the Atarka Red deck, but not nearly enough mana to utilize. And we're going to go all in on this Misery Shadow.
Love this from Zine. Just get this game over with. Don't give Powers that many draws off the top of his deck to get back into it.
Yeah, and we're leaving Mutavault back to block to trade with Kumano faces Kakazan. I think this is a pretty smart play. Missing out on 2 damage, but you don't want to get combo killed. No Atarka's Command fired off in step.
Well, you probably want to keep that one so that when the block happens, you can keep your creature around.
Sure.
I think they drew another Atarka's Command off the top, too. So things could get a little bit interesting here if Bernie's top of the deck is not very strong.
All right, we have to take 1 from the Carplusion Force. We're getting very close to dying to Misery Shadow next turn. Yeah. But we're going to be able to save our creature and send Bruni down to 7. Going to go back Bruni's way.
So this could potentially be an attack for 7, 8 if Bruni draws an untapped land, which will be 1 short of lethal. I think that was a land. But yeah, an edict here from the Liliana, and now the battlefield is clear. So I think you got to feel pretty good to just attack with the Shadow and put Powers to 1. Because that's going to turn off the Carplucid Forest too. It's going to limit what Powers can do.
Yeah, you don't want to get it eaten by a play with fire off the top because it is one of your only ways to win. Okay. And so if you leave it big enough, you can essentially just put them in what we call the abyss, where every single turn they have to block and their creatures 100% to die. And what with powers being low on resources and mana, just can't quite keep up with Mithril Shadow.
Looks like he had another squee and something else in the hand. It just drew all of his high casting cost cards and got stuck on 2 lands there. And the Liliana kind of ate him alive. A card that, neither of us thought was going to perform well in this matchup and could get sideboarded out. Really paying off for Bruni to keep that in.